Well, we're going to jump right into it. This is a more, closer up perspective on a typical kind of prototypical hypothetical cell in your body, kind of showing all the organelles, which we'll be discussing. As I said today, for today's particular lecture series, we're going to be focusing on this one right here, the plasma membrane. So first of all, the plasma membrane is going to be composed of this double layer of these phospholipids. We discussed these in Unit 2, and we spent some time on them. We talked about that nonpolar fatty acid tail. We talked about the polar hydrophilic head, which includes a phosphate group. And this is what it looks like in reality. My suggestion to you is you go ahead and draw in your notebook something simple like this, just so you get that idea of the bilipid to lipid membranes. Now don't be tricked out here. Most of the membrane is made of fat. Most of the membrane is made of those fatty acid tails, and so it is considered to be a nonpolar structure. It just happens to also have polar heads to allow for it to be in existence in the water-filled intracellular fluid and the water-filled extracellular fluid. Everything else in between here is fatty. So if something wants to cross, for example, from one side to the other, it really can't be polar, or if it is polar, it's going to have to take on some tricks, which we will talk about. If you want something to leave or something to enter into the cell, out of the cell, then it has to pass through this fatty acid layer. So the plasma membrane itself is mostly lipid. So the phospholipid tails, as you can see, they line up facing each other, and they line up next to each other, and they line up facing each other. Now there are a few structures that you'll be able to see right away, and perhaps you'll recognize them. If not, go ahead and go back to the previous unit and take a look. Maybe you sketch some of these things out. I always recommend sketching things out. We'll be doing some drawing together as well, but the more time you take with these videos leading up to class, it's always going to be beneficial to you to really draw things. And if you draw them, if you can draw something, even if you needed a lot of help, if you drew it, by looking back and forth many, many times in the book or at these lectures, if you can draw things, you understand them a little bit better. So my recommendation is always to do that. So this is a kind of cool little guide here that shows the different structures that are found in the plasma membrane. So it's called a lipid raft. The lipid rafts make up about 20% of the membrane and serve as platforms for receptors. Now, here we have, on this side, we're looking at the lipids. So here we're kind of dividing everything. I don't know if this is, so this is the lipids here. You may recognize this structure, that 4-ring structure, as cholesterol, and you'll see them actually, if you look back at this kind of more typical picture, you'll actually see cholesterol buried within here. That actually keeps things moving around. It is called a fluid mosaic. There it is, fluid mosaic structure, because things are not just static, and it's not like a typical solid. It's actually like this oily thing where things are kind of floating around all the time in it. So that's the fluid part of it. The mosaic part is, it's not this. It's not a single, it's not just a double layer of lipids. It's got lots of different things in there, and that's where the word mosaic comes from. Anyway, so on this part of it, they're showing the different lipids. They're showing the phospholipids. They're showing the cholesterol, and so we're pretty familiar with that. And oh gosh, I really want you to be able to recognize these proteins. They do tend to be portrayed in this textbook. They tend to be portrayed in purple. They're oftentimes embedded in membranes, as you see here. Many of them go all the way from one side to the other. And just so you know, the outside of the cell, or what we call the extracellular fluid, is always portrayed above. So that's shown here. Extracellular fluid, the fluid outside of the cell, is always portrayed above. The intracellular fluid, also called the cytoplasm, is going to be portrayed below, and then you'll have the plasma membrane in between. And yes, you have many proteins that actually span directly from inside to outside. These would be called transmembrane proteins. You'll see not all of them are, but many of them are. So you actually have that kind of, sometimes communication between the two sides of the plasma membrane. You'll notice this stuff here, this is called the glycocalyx. The root glyco refers to sugar. The glycocalyx is the fuzzy, sticky, sugar-rich, carbohydrate-rich area at the cell's surface. This oftentimes acts for cell-to-cell signaling to help, for example, identify a cell as a particular type of cell, or identify a cell as, yes, I belong to this person, for example. So that oftentimes is the job of carbohydrates, which are either stuck directly onto some lipids or directly onto the proteins. So that would be glycolipids or glycoproteins, for example. So you hear those terms. Glyco meaning sugar, and then attached to the lipid or attached to the protein. What else do we have here? So that is kind of the way that the plasma membrane looks, what its composition is generally.